Vayi Bashana Chamishis, and it was in the 5th year, Lamelech Rechavim, of the reign of King Rechavim. Ola Shishak Melech Mitzrayim al Yerushalayim. Shishak, the king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem. Vayikach Hasotzros Beis HaMelech, he took the treasures from the house of the temple. Hasotzros Beis HaMelech, and the treasures from the palace of the king. Ves Hakol Lokach, everything he took. And portions say, what was that Hakol? The added Hakol is also he took the throne that Shlomo made, the beautiful mechanical throne. Mechanical.
How was it?
It had lions that he was able to move. And the Medrash says they were miraculously moving. That if anybody came before King Shlomo and lied when he was judging, the lions would come down and bite the person. Well, that's the Medrash. Whether we take that literally or not, I don't know. But Shlomo could move them mechanically. Maybe that's what it means. Hello? Remind me I have a doctor's appointment. Okay. They know who they're dealing with. I could forget easily. Okay, so anyway, we asked Rosa Beisim. He took the throne, the mechanical throne of Shlomo's. So we said, the Medrash says it would come down and bite those who lied, and maybe it's the point is that since Shlomo could move them, the superstitious people that were standing there may have been fear that maybe the lion was going to come down and do something to them because they saw it moving. Who knows? But anyway, that's the Medrash. Vayikach is called Megini Hazov Asher also Shlomo, and he took all of the shields. Remember, Shlomo made shields that he hung, displayed in his base Yar Halabonon, the antechamber, where it looked like he was a forest, and Shlomo would stroll to calm his nerves in the forest.
Made out of gold.
No, made out of cedar wood. The Megine, the shields were made out of gold. Yes, you're right.
Right.
That's Megini Gazov Asher also
Shlomo. He spilled. He has to.
Vayas HaMelech Rechavim Tachto Megine Nechoshes. He made them in copper, and we asked the question, why did he make them in copper? Because if you polish and shine up copper, what does it look like?
Gold.
Especially off from a distance. It will look like gold. So he lost the gold ones because Shishak took them in spoils. And so he fashioned, the Rechavim we're talking about, fashioned copper ones to take their place. And he entrusted them, or he deposited them with the runners that would herald his coming into the Beis HaMikdash. Shomrim Pesach Beis HaMelech, those who were guarding the entranceway to the king's house, the palace. And when the king would go to the Beis HaMikdash, the runners would carry them, and alongside of the king's procession, they would escort the king. And when the king returned from the Beis HaMikdash, they would return them to their Tei HaRotzim, this chamber where they hung. Yes, Divrei Rechavim, and the rest of the accomplishments of Rechavim, also all that he did, they are recorded in the Chronicles of the kings of Yahudah. There was a war between Rechavim and Yeravim all of their days. Skirmishes, not major fights, but we'll see. Rechavim was laid to rest with his fathers. He was buried with his ancestors, meaning David and Shlomo, in the city of David. Excuse me. V'shem Imo, and the name of his mother was Nama Ammonis, Nama the Ammonite, in which we talked about the difference in the seeming contradiction between an assessment of her character, whether she was good like Rus, or whether she was evil. Here the Mefarshim all say she was evil. And that's why it explains Rechavim's dalliance with evil ways. He learned it from his mother.
Why is it mentioning that?
Why is it mentioning it again?
Why is it mentioning it here? After
well, it's summing up, here we're summing up his life. And we're not saying very many nice things about him here. There's no statement here that he followed in the ways of David his father and he was laid to rest. It was said that he was buried there, but it doesn't speak about his qualities of life, how he led his life, and up until now we've seen either he did foolish things or he did evil things. But we'll see. We're going to flesh it in a little bit from Chronicles. Vayimlach Aviyam b'no tachtav, and Aviyam, his son, rules in his place. Now, let's switch to Chronicles. Chronicles was, we know, written by Ezra, the scribe, in the first generation of the return to the land of Israel after the Babylonian exile. And Ezra was the spiritual leader of that return, in a sense. Zerubbabel preceded him for a number of years, 18 or so years. But ultimately, Ezra came. Ezra waited in Bothel until Baruch ben Neriah died. Who was Baruch ben Neriah? Baruch ben Neriah was the student of Yirmiyahu Hanavi. Yirmiyahu lived through the destruction of the first temple. Baruch ben Neriah, his Talmud, his student, followed in the footsteps of his illustrious teacher. And Ezra stayed behind in Bavel to tend to Baruch ben Neriah in his very old age, and as he was passing along, he waited for him to die before he came to Eretz Yisrael.
So why didn't Baruch come to Israel?
But he was too old and too feeble to make
Didn't
the trip.
Yirmiyahu
Well, there's
buy
a whole
a piece of
difference.
land?
Yeah, that's right. And he told Baruch ben Neriah to write down the fact that he bought the land and to describe the land and put it in a urn and preserve that urn, because in 70 years the people were going to come back to Israel. Yeah, that's true. That's in the book of Yirmiyahu. Baruch ben Neriah was his student, Yirmiyahu's student. Anyway, Ezra comes to Eretz Yisrael, and he picks up the baton and he raises the spiritual level of the people. He, Ezra, and the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. He was one of the members, perhaps the chief judge of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. Shimon HaTzadik, you know that neighborhood here in Yerushalayim, was Mishiyore Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the last remaining judges of the men of the Great Assembly. What was the men of the Great Assembly, just for your edification? It was a 120-man chamber, a Sanhedrin comprised of 120 members. Now we know from the Torah that HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu, Isfuli Shivimish, gather together 70 people. When Moshe Rabbeinu complains that the burden of leading and carrying the Jewish people is too great for him because there was a multitude of people and there were many issues that had to be addressed, and he could not possibly address them all. Many of them were personal, some of them were tribal, some of them maybe national, but there was just a burden on Moshe Rabbeinu. And Hashem tells him, gather together 70 men, and I will, God speaking, take some of the spirit, the Kedusha that's on you, and I will give it to them. And they will become what we call now the Sanhedrin, 70 men. Well, in the days of Ezra, after the destruction of the first temple, there were so many issues, and there was such a spiritual, let's put it, decline. Why was there a spiritual decline? Because many people thought the covenant was broken. They saw the Beis HaMikdash be destroyed. They saw the institution of the king be, gone, destroyed too. And they saw no more Nevi'im, no more really prophets walking the land and instructing the people. And, the Beis HaMikdash gone, the king's gone, the Nevi'im are gone, and they thought this is all a sign that since we, the children of Israel, sinned, especially since we sinned in the sin of idolatry, that God revoked the covenant. It was no longer a bris, and therefore there was no longer a need to keep the Torah and the mitzvahs. And many of the Jews intermarried. Okay? So Ezra, in leading a spiritual revival, said it's not enough for there to be only 70. We need to have 120 people, judges of exceptional character and of course honesty and piety and scholarship, and he convened a chamber of 120. That chamber lasted until they all died out, and Shimon HaTzadik was the last. Thereafter,
There weren't so many Jews who came back.
there were 40,000 Jews that came back, but there were many who were intermarried, and there were Jews still in Bavel, and there were Jews scattered around other areas. And so they needed a very powerful body and to, first of all, bring the Jews back to the land. Ultimately, many Jews came back to Eretz Yisrael. It was only the first wave, as we say in the modern time, the Aliyah Rishonah, or the Aliyah Yeshana, the old Aliyah, the original Aliyah, which came back from Europe, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So there was one wave, and then another wave, and then a third wave. Anyway, so too in the days of the second Commonwealth, which starts with Ezra and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel. They reconstitute the people of Israel in the land of Israel. And so Ezra broadened the base of the Sanhedrin to 120. That's the Anshe Knesset Agdola. Anyway,
Rabbi,
yes, sir.
do you know anything about the vetting process to become a member of the Sanhedrin?
Well, the Torah tells you what it is. Anshe Chayil, Sonei Betza, Yirei Elokim. The Torah tells you what it was, and whether or not they could find people like that so easily. What does that mean? Anshe Chayil, men of valor. What does men of valor mean? What are they going to go to war? What does it mean when it says men of valor? It means men who are not afraid to speak the truth. Men who will stand up for their convictions and express what they believe to be the truth. Sonei Betza, they hate graft, bribery, dishonesty, basically honest people, straightforward, honest judges. Sonei Betza, Anshe Chayil, Yirei Elokim, that they have God, they have Yirah Shamayim, they fear God. They are not just upstanding, let's call it righteous kind of a people who have integrity, but they also have the fear of God. Yirah Shamayim. That's what that's the vetting process. To the extent that they met those standards, I wasn't there. I would assume that they made a great effort to do that. Okay. Anyway, that's who wrote Divrei Hayamim. So now let's pick up in Divrei Hayamim. I'm going to switch to Divrei Hayamim. That's Chronicles. I'm going to switch to Chronicles 2. There's Chronicles 1 and there's Chronicles 2. Remember one thing, that in the Jewish tradition, there is no Shmuel Aleph, there's no Shmuel Beis. There's Shmuel, Sefer Shmuel. There's no Sefer Melachim Aleph, Sefer Melachim Beis. The description of this course was we're learning Melachim Aleph. That is a result of the Christians dividing Melachim, the Book of Kings, into two parts. The same thing with Chronicles. There's no Chronicles 1, Chronicles 2 in our tradition all the way back. It's as a result of the printers. When they printed the Bible, they broke it down into Chronicles 1, Chronicles 2, same thing with Samuel, same thing with Kings and Chronicles. And they also introduced chapters. We do not have chapters in our tradition. We have what's called Sidrot. Means that there are breaks in the Masoretic text or in the text of the prophets. Paragraph breaks. There are two types of paragraph breaks, but whatever it is, we had paragraph breaks. And through studying the paragraph breaks, for instance, the Abarbanel, and he writes his Perush. The Abarbanel, when he wrote his massive Perush on Tanakh, does not go by chapters. He goes by Sidros. And that's what we call a Sedra. When we say the Parshas HaShavua, we call it the Sedra. You ever hear that term?
Right.
The Sedra doesn't mean what we think it means, the Parsha. It means how the Torah was broken up in the Masoretic format that appears in the scroll of the Torah. That is by Sidros. Okay? Anyway, so we're talking Chronicles 2 here because ever since the Christians published the Bible, the Jewish people said, hey, Chochma ba'goyim tamid. When the goyim do something wise, we should not just spit on it, but we should embrace it. So therefore, ever since the Bible was printed in Hebrew, ultimately the printing press adapted to the Hebrew language. The publishers of all of the Tanakh and the Humashim followed that breakdown that the Christian Bible follows. And all the sentence numbers, when we say today, we're going to start with chapter 11 in Chronicles 2. Chronicles 2 is Christian. Chapter 11 is Christian. Sentence, we're going to start with sentence 5. All that is Christian. Now, the Sof Pasuk, we have a cantillation that accompanies our Torah and our Tanakh, which is how we lane when we read the Torah on Shabbos from the pulpit, from the Amud. We read it with a sort of sing-song kind of cantillation. That's post-biblical, that's Midrabanan. And the rabbis instituted the cantillation so that the Torah would not be read in a monotone and we'd all fall asleep in the middle of Kriyas HaTorah. Mm-hmm. So they introduced cantillation. The one thing they did not introduce, which is a heritage from Moshe Rabbeinu, from Har Sinai, is periods at the end of sentences. So the sentence structure that we have today is Jewish in origin, all the way back to the time the Torah was given with sentence structure. But the paragraphs that we have, the chapters, all that is from the Gentile Bible. Anyway, we're going to read now Chronicles 2, chapter 11, verse 5 we're going to pick up. Which, by the way, in the Masoretic text is a break. What?
I found it.
You found it?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Vayeshev Rechavim B'Yerushalayim. We're now the Chronicles. Remember now, Ezra drew this information from the book of Chronicles of the Kings of Yahudah, which we just read. Rechavim was laid to rest, and all that he accomplished is recorded Halohema Ksuvim al Sefer Divrei Hayamim L'Malchi Yehuda, recorded in the Chronicles of the Kings of Yahudah. So this information that we're going to read from Chronicles 2 is supplemental information that's not set forth in the book of Kings. So since Ezra was not a prophet, how did he know to include this supplemental information in his book of Chronicles? The answer is, most Mefarshim say, that he got it from the book of the records of the Kings of Yahudah, which he had available to him, which have subsequently been lost to Jewish history. Because they weren't holy, but they had information. Vayeshev Rechavim b'Yerushalayim, and Rechavim dwelt in Jerusalem. Vayiven Orim l'Matzor b'Yehuda, and he built fortified cities in Judea, in Yehudah. Vayiven es Beis Lechem, he built up Bethlehem, meaning he fortified it. Ve'es Eitam, ve'es Tekoa. Some of these names are familiar to us today. Ve'es Beis Tzur, ve'es Socho, ve'es Adulam. These are familiar to us today. Ve'es Gat, ve'es Moresha, ve'es Zif. Ve'es Adorayim, ve'es Lachish is known to us. Ve'es Azekah is known to us. Ve'es Tzora, ve'es Hayolon, ve'es Chevron, asher b'Yehuda, Binyamin Orim Utzuros. He built, he fortified these cities. Why did he fortify so many cities?
Yeah,
That's what you were going to ask me, right, Val? The answer is he anticipated war with Rechavim, with Yeravah ben Nevat. He anticipated a war with the kingdom of Israel. So he fortified many cities around his realm. And he fortified them over again. And he deputized various governors to lead all of these regions and cities. And he stored in each one of these cities ma'achol, food, b'shemen, and oil, b'yayin, and wine, in anticipation of sieges. What?
How did he fortify? When he fortified them, what did he do to fortify them?
Well, he probably went to Home Depot. He had stones built, walls, fortifications, ramparts, towers, different kinds of structures.
I was
that
just curious.
Yeah, well, that's what they would do.
Okay.
They would fortify it. Like you see, we go around the country, we see remnants of Crusader forts. That's what they did. Uvechol ir bo'ir tzinosu u'melachim. And in each city, he left shields and spears. V'yechaskem laharbei ma'od. And he strengthened them tremendously from what they were. Sleepy little villages, sleepy little towns, small little cities. He made them very strong and fortified. Vayhilo Yehudah Binyamin. And he ruled over Judea and over Yehud and Binyamin. V'kohanim v'halaviyim asher b'chol Yisrael. And what about all the priests and the Levites who served in the temple or who lived in the cities scattered across the country to serve the people spiritually? Now, what's going on here? Yerovam ben Avad has set up alternative temples. He's blocking passage to the holy city of Yerushalayim and to the Beis HaMikdash. What are the Kohanim going to do? They move south. They come into Judea. They abandon the kingdom of Israel, which is going off on its own in a deviant route to God. And so they abandon the kingdom of Israel. V'kohanim v'halaviyim asher b'chol Yisrael hisyatzvu. They gathered together. Olav mikol gvulam. They came to him, to Rechavam, from all of their various territories. Ki yazvu halaviyim es migrashayim. The Levites left their cities, uba'achuzasam and their holdings. Vayelchu liYehudah v'Yerushalayim. They came to Jerusalem, to Yehudah and to Jerusalem. Ki hiznicham Yerovam, because Yerovam abandoned them. Uvonav mikohen laHashem. He stopped them from being Kohanim. Remember, one of the things that Yerovam ben Avad instituted was, whoever wanted to be a priest could be a priest. What's with this special case, of Kohanim? That's not fair. That's not democratic, or whatever you want to call it. It's not egalitarian. We have to have anybody who wants to. And matter of fact, Yerovam ben Avad was the first one to ascend the stairway to his altar in his newly consecrated temple and began to offer a sacrifice when the old prophet from Yahudah walked in and split his altar, paralyzed his arm. Anyway, Yerovam was poised to start to inaugurate this new policy, and ultimately he inaugurates the new policy. So all the Kohanim and the Leviim are disenfranchised, basically, and so they move south. Vayamed lo Kohanim labomas la'asirim la'golim asher asa. But Yerovam established Kohanim for the bomos and for the asheros and for the this is Yerovam ben Avad. He put new Kohanim, his newly empowered Kohanim, anybody from any shevet, from any family, for all of the private altars that he built. La Seirim, for all the Avodah Zaras that ultimately sprang up. V'la Golim, into the calves, the golden calves, Asher Asa, which he did. So now the Kohanim and the Leviim move south. V'achareim mikol shiftei Yisrael hanosim es Olam levakesh es Hashem Elokei Yisrael. Not just the Kohanim, and not just the Leviim who were disenfranchised, but all those who were true to the spirit of Hashem. Achareihem, after them, mikol shiftei Yisrael, from all of the tribes of Israel. Hanosnim es levavam levakesh es Hashem Elokei Yisrael, who gave their hearts to seek out God, the true God of Israel. Bo Yerushalayim, they came south. Lizboach LaShem, to sacrifice to God, Elokei Avoseim, the God of their ancestors. Vayechasku es Malchus Yehudah. And this influx of new people from the other tribes flooding south, together with the Kohanim and the Leviim, they strengthened the kingdom of Yehudah. Vayamtzu es Rechavim ben Shlomo, and they gave courage to Rechavim, the son of Shlomo. L'shanim shalosh, for 3 years, everything seemed to be going right. Ki holchu b'derech David, because in those first 3 years, after Yerovam ben Avad split off from Malchus Yehudah, from the kingdom of Yehudah, and abandoned Rechavim and appointed and crowned Yerovam ben Avad to be king, for the first 3 years, everything was good. People were coming to the south for spiritual purposes. And they for 3 years they followed in the ways of David and Shlomo. They moved south. They abandoned the kingdom of Israel. Vayikach lo Rechav Misha es Mochlas ben Bas, it should say Yerimos ben David, Abichail bas Eliyahu ben Yishai, married relatives of his, and they bore him children, and he loved one wife more than others. Who is that reminiscent of? Reminiscent of Shlomo, who loved the daughter of Paro more than all of his other foreign wives. And then he took Macha, and he has other children. Vayev Rechav and Mismacha, he liked Macha. Basav Shalom, Basav Shalom, it says here. Anyway, he had 18 wives. David HaMelech had 18 wives. And Uprilakshim Shisha, but he had 60 concubines. Vayoled Esrim Ushmone Bonim, he fathered 28 sons and 60 daughters. Okay. Skip a few sentences. And now I'm going to get to Vayihi Bashona HaChamishis. And it was in the 5th year of his reign. So the first 3 years, everything's going fine, righteous, walking in the ways of David. Vayihi Bashona HaChamishis on Melech Rechavim. In the 5th year, that's 2 years after he abandoned following in the ways of David, Shishak attacks, which we read here too, but we're going to have a lot more detail here. Bashana Chamishis Melech Rechavim Ola Shishak Melech Mitzrayim Al Yerushalayim. Kimalu Bashem. For in those 2 years, in his 4th year and his 5th year, he was Mo'al Bashem. He transgressed against God. V'yelef U'mosayim Rechev, with 1,200 chariots. Uvishishim elef proshim, and 60,000 cavalrymen. V'yein mispar la'omasher bo'imo, and no count to the number of foot soldiers that came with him. This is with Shishak. That came with him from Egypt. Not only were they Egyptians, they were Luvim, they were from Luv, which is a country, they were from Sikiyim, and they were from Kushim, they were from Ethiopia. And he captured all of those fortified cities that Rechavim spent so much time, money, effort in fortifying. Shishak overwhelmed them with his massive force, and he captured them all. Ushmayo Hanavi bo el Rechavim. And Shmayo the Navi comes to Rechavim, the Sari Yahudah asher nestu al Yerushalayim, and to the officers of Yahudah, who had now fled from all of their little fortified cities, because their fortified cities were overrun. They all came to Jerusalem, the last standing fortress, and that's where they gathered. Bnei Shishak, because of the onslaught of Shishak the Egyptian. Vayomer Lahem, and so Shemayahu addresses all of the, let's call it the aristocrats and the officers of Yehudah, and he says, Ko Amar Hashem. This is the word of God. Atem azavtim osi, you have abandoned me. Va'afani azavti etzchem, and I, God, have abandoned you, biyat Shishak, and I've delivered you over to Shishak. You want to know why this is all happening? Shemayahu, he said, it's because you have abandoned my ways. Vayikonu Sari Yisrael HaMelech, and the officers of Israel and the king submitted. Vayomru, and they said, Tzadik Hashem, God is righteous, we are at fault. We deviated, we abandoned, we transgressed. Hashem is the tzaddik. Ubiros Hashem ki nichno, but when God saw their submission, Hoya devar Hashem el Shemayahu lemor, God sent Shemayahu Hanavi back a second time, saying the following words: Nichnu, they have submitted. Lo ashchisem, I will not destroy them. V'nosati lahem kimat lefleta, and I will give them a remnant. A remnant for a refuge. I will not just cast my anger against Jerusalem b'yat Shishak, through the hands of Shishak. I'm still going to have you serve as vassals to Shishak. And you will then know, since you are doing tshuva, you will know my service, the service of God. And you will also know serving the foreign powers. Vayal Shishak Melch Mitzrayim al Yerushalayim, and Shishak proceeds to attack. Vayikach Hasotzos Beis Hashem. He cleans out the treasure houses of the Beis Hamikdash. V'esotzos Beis Hamelach. Es Hakol Lokach, same words that we read. Vayikach es Mogini Hazov. He took the golden shields as Yeros Shlomo. Vayas Hamelach v'chav tachteim Mogini Nechoshes. V'yiftu b'yatzori harotzim. Again, the same old story that we learned. Okay. And Rechavam then returns to some semblance of normalcy, although it's impossible to say it was really normal, because now he's a vassal to the king of Egypt. Vayimloch, and he rules, he was 41 when he ruled, etc., and he rules for 17 years. Okay, that's the add-on that the book of Chronicles adds on. We have at least one remaining question, which we need to address. What is that question? Why
I was wondering, what did he do wrong after all the good years of the
after the first 3 years? After the first 3 years,
it doesn't say really what he.
He began to sin. What was his sin exactly? Probably similar to the sins of Yerovam ben Nebat, but not completely. I mean, he sinned. It doesn't say, you're right, it doesn't say what he did. However, what's really a problem here is, why isn't this in the Book of Kings? Why was this, let's not say censored, but why was it omitted from the Book of Kings? That's a very powerful question. If all this is truly what happened, which Ezra, of course, gleaned from the Book of Chronicles of the kings of Yahudah, why is this missing from the story of Malchus Yahudah? Okay. Now, in the Book of Kings, until the kingdom of Israel is destroyed, which is in approximately 280 some years after the institution of monarchy, the Tanakh, the Sefer, the Book of Kings, basically distinguishes between the kings of Yahudah and the kings of Israel. The kings of Israel, there is only one king that is favorably mentioned in the Book of Kings. That is a king of Israel, and that is Yehu ben Nimshi. It will tell us that he did good or proper and righteous in the eyes of God. Every other king of the kings of Israel, Vayas hara b'einei Hashem. That king did evil in the eyes of God. For that very reason, the Abarbanel attacks the institution of a king and says that it was a grievous mistake for the Jewish people to request a king, because all the kings of Israel were wicked or did evil in the eyes of God. And even in the kings of Yahudah, many of them, not all of them, but there was at least something like 40% who did evil in the eyes of God, maybe 60% who were righteous. And so the Abarbanel therefore says this institution of a monarchy is defective. It's born from that statement that we make in Western civilization. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Kings became enthralled with their power. They became arrogant. It's all me, 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 me. And ultimately they corrupted their ways because of their arrogance and their aggregation of power to themselves, and their taking advantage of their positions of power. They corrupted themselves and the kingdom.
Reminds us of something?
Excuse me?
Reminds us of something?
Yes, it reminds us of somebody who doesn't know when to step down. Okay, same problem, in a sense. Okay, so now the point is, the Book of Kings is distinguishing between the ruling families of Israel and the ruling families of Judea, of Yahudah. And the Book of Kings tries to elevate the kings of Yahudah over the kings of Israel. Why? because ultimately they both kings of Yahudah and the kings of Israel devolve or corrupt themselves into idolatrous practices.
Hasn't Yaakov given Malchus to Yehudah?
That's a whole big question. Hold that in abeyance a moment.
Okay.
Maybe we'll come back to that. Eventually we'll discuss it. If not today, some other time. Hold that question. But what I'm trying to tell you is that the kings of Yahudah were not in the same vein as the kings of Israel. The kings of Israel were much more corrupted than the kings of Yahudah. Why is this a very important distinction to make? A, it's the truth. B, it's historical. C, the kingdom of Yahudah, although it ultimately becomes idolatrous, does not cease. We don't speak about the lost tribes of Yahudah, yet we speak about the lost tribes of the kingdom of Israel. We talk about the 10 lost tribes. But if in the final analysis the kings of Israel became idolators, and if in the final analysis the kings of Yahudah became idolators, why do they suffer a dissimilar fate?
Mature.
Why do the kings of Yahudah, meaning us, the remnants of Yahudah, by the way, when we say the remnant of Yahudah, which ultimately returned from the Babylonian exile and rebuilt the second Commonwealth, which then itself was destroyed by the Romans, we consider ourselves the legacy of Malchus Yahudah. That doesn't mean that we were all from the tribe of Yahudah, because as we read, many Jews moved south and joined into the kingdom of Yahudah. So we're a blend of all the tribes. But why did our fate, meaning our ancestors, ultimately why did we survive Jewish history? And the 10 lost tribes are lost to Jewish history, except for stragglers, and may have filtered down into us. What is this? The answer is that's what the Navi is trying to point out. The Navi is trying to extol, in a sense, and sometimes even turn a blind eye to the failures of the kingdom of Yahudah, because it wants us to understand the big difference between the 10 tribes that are lost to Jewish history, and the remainder of Judaism, the remainder of the tribes. It's okay today. All right, don't worry, keep it slow. And the remainder of the tribes, those that return, those that we are the legacy of.
Yes.
The answer is, what was the original deviation? When Yerovim ben Nevat came on the scene and felt at a disadvantage to the kings of Yahudah, because the kings of Yahudah had the temple and they had the sacrificial rites, and basically we see now as a result of, he thought he was going to make everything egalitarian, and in that way he would make it attractive, and in that way he would make it enduring. It was a bankrupt policy. It didn't make it enduring. It didn't attract people to move south. It didn't fortify any spirituality in his kingdom, which he thought it would. It turned deviant, and it turned ultimately into idolatry. But when you start on a route where you think you are spiritual, and you think everything you do is directed to raising the spirituality of the people, where in a sense it's a corruption of the Torah and the values of our tradition, the ultimate result is you become deviant and you don't even realize it. You think what you're doing is spiritual. You think, I have found the right path. I'm going to make it available to all the people. I'm going to let everybody be a priest. I'm going to have little, shtiblach with altars all over the countryside. You never stop to reassess, because you think you're walking in a spiritual path. You've taken a spiritual route. You've plowed a spiritual route. That leads to extinction. That leads to assimilation. That leads to the destruction of spiritual values. So Yerovim ben Nevat's effort led to destruction of spiritual values. The kingdom of Yahudah, on the other hand, plunged into idolatry. They didn't justify idolatry as a spiritual route to God. They abandoned God and they adopted idolatry. They didn't decline on a slippery slope from a false sense of religion to idolatry. They went right from true religion down into idolatry. And as a result, when they reassessed their position, they realized they took an alternate route and they need to go back and join the right route so they could do tshuva. But Yeravim ben Avat's path, which split off and claimed that it was equally as spiritual and maybe even superiorly spiritual, because now everybody could be a Kohen. Everybody could do a spiritual act. From that you don't return, because then you just build on, you continue to build on it, and basically, without really getting, I don't want to get too political, but we see that in front of our eyes. You know, when I grew up in the 50s, 1850s, no, 1950s. When I grew up in the 50s, there was a major article in Look magazine, which was a very popular magazine, that predicted the spiritual demise of Orthodox Jewry. Because in the aftermath of the Holocaust, there was very little to salvage from the Holocaust, considering the numbers of religious Torah-committed Jews that perished in the Holocaust. There were fragments in the United States, and you might even say there were 10 people that are responsible for the spiritual rejuvenation of Judaism in the United States and ultimately in the world. Their forecasters forecast the doom and the end of Orthodox Jewry. What was going to be ascendant? What was going to survive? Reform, conservative. They found ways to accommodate to modernity. They found ways to retain spiritual values, deviant as they may have been from halacha. Maybe, and many times they weren't, but sometimes they were. But that was what was the forecasters' analysis of the survival of Judaism in the 50s and perhaps all the way into the 60s and maybe even into the 70s.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Following this reasoning, complete reasoning, one should say that conservative is more dangerous than reform.
I don't know. I'll tell you another thing that I said many, many, many years ago, which I got very criticized for, but let's first finish this thought. This thought is that when you start a deviant path to spirituality, you end up with assimilation, you end up losing, and they are declining and declining and declining, and the handwriting is on the wall. And the Pew reports are projecting their demise. And whereas in the 50s and 60s, orthodoxy was supposed to die, what's happening is reform is either intermarrying at a tremendous rate, way beyond 50%, 70%, and it's only it's a shame and it's a terrible tragedy, but in another generation they'll be gone. Basically lost to Judaism. So we're talking about Yeravim ben Avat. You make up your own spiritual way. You think you're doing a service to the faith. You're not true to its traditions and its laws, to the Torah. You will end up being assimilated and lost to history. Why they don't see this on the... They should by now see the handwriting on the wall. What they're trying to do is transport it to Israel. Because they feel in Israel there's not that much pressure of assimilation, because we're all Jews here, basically. So they think their last bastion, their last stronghold will be the state of Israel, and therefore all of these battles to establish themselves and get recognition here in the state of Israel is their death throes, the dying gasp, and their chance, their desperate reach to try to preserve their way and their teachings. Only Hashem knows what will happen. In the diaspora, it was an abysmal failure. Okay. Now, what was the question you asked me? Oh. What's more dangerous? I don't know what's more dangerous.
No, because one is...
Okay, so I'm going to tell you another thing. That's what I started to say. So, back in the 60s, there were organizations, let's call it, do you ever hear of the Synagogue Council of America? Mm-hmm. Did you ever hear of the... Well, the Synagogue Council of America was a group of synagogues that formed a union comprised of Orthodox, Conservative, Reformed, perhaps even some Reconstructionist synagogues, and they formed one group. Ostensibly, this was a group to wield political power, to accomplish things that were relevant and important to all streams of Judaism. The state of Israel, hospitals, all these kind of things that were relevant to all of Israel. And therefore they decided, well, united we will stand strong, divided we will splinter. So they formed this group called the Synagogue Council of America. The OU joined the Synagogue Council of America. The Rabbinical Council of America, the rabbis from Yeshiva University basically, joined the Synagogue Council. They joined the New York Board of Rabbis, which was also a group made up of all factions. And there was a challenge to this. The Yahudah, led basically by Rabbi Aaron Cutler of blessed memory, came out very strongly against this umbrella group, condemned membership in it, and halachically outlawed membership in the Synagogue Council. Now the issue was then presented to the great Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik Zatzal, the great Rosh Yeshiva Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, Rabbi Soloveitchik. And he was the chairman of the Halachic Committee of the Rabbinical Council of America. And the rabbis in the Rabbinical Council of America were sort of split. There were some who believed we should follow what the Gedolei Yisrael or Aaron Cutler and others said. And there were some who said, no, let us put the question to Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. Let us ask Rabbi Soloveitchik. He is our spiritual mentor. The other Gedolei Yisrael are too much to the right of us. We want to know what the mainstream halacha is. We want to know what Rabbi Soloveitchik's opinion is. Guess what happened? Rabbi Soloveitchik said, maintain the status quo until my halachic committee, which I chair, will issue a response to this issue. We will issue a responsa, what we call a tshuva. I will answer this question, and I will ponder it with my committee, and we will come to a conclusion. And in the interim, don't change anything. How long did this interim last? Forever. He never issued an opinion. And whenever the issue would come up, he would say, we are pondering this situation, maintain the status quo. I did not yet issue my opinion, my halachic opinion. What was Rabbi Soloveitchik saying? He was saying, I don't want to come out against all the Gedolim, Rav Aaron Cutler, etc., but I don't believe they're right. If he believed they were right, 1, 2, 3, he would have issued a decision. He wouldn't have said, maintain the status quo while I ponder the question. What was the status quo? Continue to be a member. Continue to join in these umbrella groups. So he said, maintain the status quo until I issue a halachic decision, and he never issued a halachic decision. That was his decision. That was what he was saying.
Can we relate this with Rabbi, the chief rabbi of England going...
Which chief rabbi?
The new one.
Mervis?
Yes.
Going where?
He went to a seafair with all the different kind of Judaism.
Well, it could be. We could relate it to that too. I'm not really particularly familiar with the facts of that case. I am familiar with the facts that I expressed to you because my father was deeply involved in this issue.
Who are the groups? Who are the groups involved?
Who was the group? There was the Rabbinical Council of America.
No, yes.
There was the OU, which the OU remained as part of the Synagogue Council.
Yeah.
Rabbinical Council of America remained also as part of
But
basically...
you said the Reform?
Who were the others? The Reform, the Conservative, and the Reconstructionists. The other streams of Judaism, let's call it. The ones who were unaffiliated, they didn't care, they didn't join anything. But the ones that had a synagogue body, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionists, they were all members of the Synagogue Council.
Are they Jews, the Reconstructionists?
Are they Jews? I'm not going to, I have no idea. It depends on which one. Some of them probably are Jews, some of them aren't, I don't know. Okay, halachically Jews or something.
Okay.
Okay, anyway, this was a very interesting thing, and we grew up in the yeshiva, debating all these issues, contemplating all these issues. It's all passé at this point, because now we see Reform and Conservative self-destructing.
Excuse me, but there is a psak halacha, Rabbi Dober Soloveitchik, about discussing or not discussing with,
That's
with
true.
Christians.
That's right.
And the Psak Halacha is
Not getting involved in ideological discussions of faith matters with Gentiles.
Can we apply the same idea?
Can we apply the same idea to Jews? No.
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 Machlokes.
Yeah. Well, this is a very interesting question, which since that time in the 50s and 60s when Rav Kotler and the Rosh Yeshivas came out with the Isser of joining the Synagogue Council, they also said in that broad statement of condemnation that we should not recognize conservative, reform, reconstructionist rabbis. If we recognize them as rabbis, then we are giving credence to their philosophies in some way, shape, or form. And as a result, we should have nothing to do with reform, conservative, reconstructionist rabbis. This was not to say we should not discuss things with other Jews, only their religious leadership. This draws from a statement made by the Rambam about the Karaites. And the Rambam said that we should have nothing to do with the Karaite leadership because they are the ones that are misleading the people. But as far as the people are concerned, they are ignorant. They don't know. They are what we call tinek shenishba. They are like children that were captured in their infancy, and they don't know better, and therefore they are considered full-fledged Jews. We talk to them, we interact with them. We should not interact with Karaite leadership. As a result, they translated or transferred that theory to conservative, reform, reconstructionist rabbis. We should have nothing to do with them. And that became an issue with the sort of New York Board of Rabbis. The New York Board of Rabbis was the biggest rabbinic organization in the United States because New York had the most shuls and rabbis. And in the New York Board of Rabbis, there were conservative, reform, reconstructionist, Orthodox rabbis who were members. These Gedolim, when they prohibited the Synagogue Council, also prohibited the New York Board of Rabbis. Rabbi Soloveitchik again was asked, and again he said, I'm going to rule on that, and he never ruled on it. Keep the status quo, and when I give you your ruling, you'll know what my opinion is. And he never issued a ruling, and so they stayed. The New York Board of Rabbis has also, it still exists, but it's really disintegrating also. In the Orthodox have moved to the right. Everybody's moved to the right. You know what I always say? It's a good thing they proved the world wasn't flat, because everybody's moving to the right, they would have fallen off.
Rabbi, what was Chabad's position at that time?
Excuse me, what was whose?
Chabad.
I don't know what the Rebbe held.
Rabbi says a Jew, whatever, it doesn't exist.
Everybody says that.
So remember, what's a Karaite?
A Karaite is somebody who believes, there's
Only in the written Torah.
Yeah, there was a great change in the Karaite position over the years. Originally, the Karaites, where does that name come from? The Karaites come from the Shomronim. They were the Tiglath-Pileser, Sancherib, the Assyrians that conquered the 10 tribes believed in population transfer. And so they transferred Gentiles into the land of Israel, into the kingdom of Israel, which they conquered. And they moved Jews and scattered them over their empire. So the Jews that came were called Shomronim because they settled in the land of Samaria, in the region of Samaria. And they ultimately converted because they were attacked by beasts of the field. And they could find no peace in the land of Israel. And so they converted, in a sense, to Judaism. We consider them Gerei Arroyos. They are converts prompted by outside pressure of the lions. The lions were attacking them. The beasts were attacking them. And therefore, there's a great question as to their bona fide conversions. It was almost like they converted under the gun. Is that considered a conversion or not a conversion? And the debate goes down all the way into the Talmud.
And the Karaites didn't believe in the all.
The Karaites then were basically offshoots from these Samaritans. The Samaritans raised their ugly head in the time of Ezra's return to Israel. They challenged the rebuilding of the temple. They somehow became infatuated with Har Gerizim and Har Eval, and they believed that that was the real true place, A, of the Akedah, B, of where the capital
They
of
have a
Jerusalem.
temple of Haggadah.
They have a temple there, and they originally believed in the Torah Shebiksav that we have, and they rejected the Torah Shebaal Peh.
So they were the leaders?
Whoa. What? Excuse me?
The Karaites were the leaders? Were the
Karaites is the faction, the name of the faction. Okay? They were called a sect. When Josephus writes about his history of the Jews, he lists them as a sect of Judaism. They were much closer to our faith in those days of Josephus, which is the end of the Second Temple, because initially what they believed was in the Torah Shebiksav, in the written Torah, not in the oral Torah, but not in the sense that everybody thinks they didn't believe in the oral Torah, because if you don't believe in the oral Torah, you don't have a Torah.
They still exist?
Yes, they have a place in Jerusalem.
The
In
Karaites?
the
In the
old
old city, in the old city.
There's a Karaite temple in the old city. They are very small in number.
It's not a temple, it's true.
Sure. Okay. They, not a temple in terms of a Beit HaMikdash, but a temple in terms of a
Because
synagogue.
basically touches on Haggadah.
Right. Okay. They originally, well, first of all, nobody ever rejected the Torah Shebaal Peh outright. Because if you don't have a Torah Shebaal Peh, you don't have
I know what that
anything.
means.
Okay, the oral law.
Okay, thank
Torah Shebaal Peh is the Torah that is transmitted by oral transmission. If you don't believe in the oral transmission of the Torah, you have no Torah. When the Torah says put on tefillin, they should be a sign between your eyes and bind them on your hand. What? Where? When? How? What do they look like? What are they? What are you binding? Where do you get this box from? Why is it black? Why are there straps? They had all that too. Where'd they get that from?
So what did
They got it from the oral transmission, the oral law. It says sit in a sukkah. What's a sukkah? How many walls? What's the cover? What is a sukkah? When it says wear tzitzis, what they do, they hung their tzitzis on the wall. How'd they know how to make tzitzis?
So what
What are tzitzis? The Torah doesn't define any of this. All that is defined by the oral law. They adopted the oral law. Initially, what their position was is that the oral law can never change the simple meaning of the Torah text. So if the Torah says, Ure'isem also, you must see the tzitzis, you can't wear them. You have to hang them somewhere where you can see them. When the Torah says, that the tefillin should be between your eyes, they put it between their eyes, on the bridge of their nose, between their eyes. Because they said, you can't change the literal meaning of the Torah. The rabbi said it doesn't mean literally between your eyes, it means over here, between your eyes. Therefore, they adopted the Torah, they knew what tefillin were from the oral law. But they said the rabbis had no power to change the literal meaning of the Torah. When it says, Lo savaru eish b'chol moshvosechem b'yom HaShabbat, do not let a fire burn in anywhere in your dwellings during the day of Sabbath, they had no fire. They sat in the cold. They had no warm food because they believed that you're not allowed to have a fire. We believe if the fire started before Shabbos, you can have it. It means do not create a fire in your habitations.
What about Ayin Tachat Ayin?
Ayin Tachat Ayin, I don't know what they held. Really, good question. Excellent question. I don't know if they held Ayin Tachat Ayin. An eye for an eye. Did they do that literally too? Or maybe there was a Masorah all the way back to Sinai with them. I don't know. Anyway, they said, Mimochras HaShabbos, the day after Shabbos is when we do the Korban Omer and we start to count Sfiras HaOmer. They said the day after Shabbos means Sunday. The rabbi said the day after Shabbos means the day after the first day of Pesach. Shabbos in that case means the rest of the holiday, the first, or not rest, the remainder, rest meaning to cease working. That meant on the day after you ceased working, which is the first day of Chol Hamoed, the first day is when you ceased working, we start to count the Omer on the second night of Pesach. They start to count the Omer on the first Sunday after Pesach. But they counted the Omer.
Can we consider them Jews?
So that's what the Rambam says. You can consider them Jews.
So you could eventually marry one of them.
Ah, well, let's not get carried away.
You can carry out the way.
They'd have to be adopted to become Shomrei Torah mitzvahs.
No, but I mean,
There's a few places in the United States where they have Karaites.
Yeah, anyway,
In Texas.
ultimately they became more deviant and they abandoned a lot of things. But the original battles between the Chachamim and the Shomranim and the Karaites were halachic debates. And they advocated their position halachically. And there was major debates. And they were a major source of, of threat, in a sense, an ideological threat. And therefore they were scorned in a way, and ultimately they, again, the same thing that happened with Reform and Orthodox. So let me tell you what I started to say before I got sidetracked. When Orthodoxy outlawed, meaning the Torah world of Baron Kotler and the other Gedolei Yisrael outlawed being sitting with a conservative rabbi and a Reform rabbi and a Reconstructionist rabbi, what happened? Well, conservative Judaism was a reaction to Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism believed that the modern man, woman, whatever, cannot adhere to the strictures of the Torah. It was just too difficult to keep Shabbos, to keep Taras HaMishpacha, family purity, to keep all of the chumras of Shabbos and all of the ritualistic laws were just too onerous. Therefore, they decided we're going to abandon all ritual. We have to keep a Jewish heart. We have to keep, all of the great values of Judaism, ethical, moral, honesty, all that we retain. We reject all rituals. Come along the conservatives and say, whoa, ho, ho. Do not throw out the baby with the bathwater. That's way too far. What we need to do is lighten up. Make it easier. Not everybody can be Orthodox. Orthodoxy, that was really the right way. But it's too onerous for the American people. It's too onerous for the masses. We need to lighten it up. If we can lighten it up, we'll retain their connection to Judaism. And whenever somebody in a conservative shul wanted to become Orthodox, basically the position was, good, let that person become Orthodox because that's for sure the right way. But we also have a right way. We are maintaining the link of millions of Jews to Judaism, and therefore our way is also valid. Comes along the Orthodox right wing and says, we can't talk to you, we can't sit with you, we don't recognize you. And as a result of us spurning them, they turned on us too. That's only natural. They said, oh, you say we're nothing, we're not religious leaders, we're misleading everybody. We think you're misleading everybody. We're the mainstream. We're really the centrist Judaism that's going to survive. You are not going to survive. And that's what that Look magazine article said. You are going to die. You're going to die on the vine. Nobody's going to follow you. It's too
Who wrote
onerous.
that article?
Who knows? It was a very famous article. It shook the world. Okay? I mean, it certainly shook the Orthodox world. But anyway, it was basically a projection that we were going to die and fade. Okay? Anyway, that's the counter reaction. You outlaw us, you disrespect us, you have nothing to do with us. We're going to abandon our theory that it's better to be Orthodox. You are deviant, you Orthodox Jews. You're far too far to the right. You know what you're like? You're like the Essenes. You know who the Essenes were? Mm-hmm. The Essenes were a sect of Judaism at the end of the Second Temple period that left Jerusalem because they felt that the Perushim, we are descendants of the Perushim, they felt the Perushim were too left-wing. They felt that let's call it the Torah world was too left-wing. We have to be much more strict. And they left the temple area. So there was deviance to the right, there was deviance to the left.
It's always been like this.
It's always been like that. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
You're right. So what happens is those who deviated to the right were also wrong.
Could you say that the Rashbi was an Essene?
Rashbi? No.
Well, influenced.
No, Rashbi was a Kabbalist.
Okay, yes.
Okay, that's a totally different classification. Okay, but anyway, Rashbi was one of the Chachamim. He was, he sat in the base medrash. He didn't, until he had to hide out. But okay, he was a mainstream rabbinic authority. He just he became extremely spiritual in that cave and wrote the Zohar according to our tradition. Others disagree that he wrote the Zohar. Whatever it is, I'm not getting into all that dispute. Rashbi was a mainstream rabbi. Okay, anyway, therefore they rejected our way. We thought we were gonna, the Gedolei Yisrael thought as a result of that article that we were dying. We have to circle the wagons. And we have to become inbred and strengthen ourselves within our own communities, and then maybe we'll survive. That was their reaction. Well, not maybe, we will survive, but the only way to survive, outlaw them, cut them off, circle the wagons, be introspective, look within ourselves, and we will survive. But the problem is that as a result of that action, yeah, we did survive, but we also alienated conservative and religious and reform rabbis, not so much reform, but certainly conservative, who would have continued to believe that orthodoxy was the ultimate correct way, only that their way was necessary for the masses. Instead, they began to say orthodoxy is deviant like the Essenes, and we are the mainstream.
This conservative rabbi down the road actually would agree with you, and he believes that orthodoxy is the right way. But he's a conservative rabbi.
That's right.
And he's
that was the opinion of many, if not the majority, overwhelming majority of the conservative leadership in the 50s and 60s. And then it's changed.
How did it change?
It changed because the Orthodox spurned them completely and rejected
Mistake. They should have welcomed them back.
I understand that. I believe it's a mistake. The Gedolei Yisrael did not believe it was a mistake. But who am I? I'm just telling you my perspective.
Excuse me. Lehavdil. Power of Tarso.
Power of
the Christians.
Oh, yes.
At a certain stage, the idea was the same.
That's right. There was a break in the church between James and Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, James was supposedly the brother of Jesus, of Yeshua. He believed that you had to remain halachically Jewish, and he stayed in Jerusalem, and he led the church in Jerusalem. And Paul went to Syria, Damascus, and when he encountered the Gentiles, he had a vision on the way to Damascus, in which supposedly Yeshua came to him and told him that you do not have to abide by halacha. Why would he say that? Because he knew that the pagan Gentile world could not circumcise, could not keep Shabbos, and therefore, if he wants to appeal to them, he had to water down Judaism.
And the follower of James, how did they change nowadays?
The follower of James died out.
They died out. Exactly, okay. Maybe
we could say that the Seventh-day Adventists are a remnant of some sort of that position.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, we got way far afield here.
Right, it's a good saying.
Okay, so we shall return to the days of yesteryear.
You know, the Conservatives have an excellent magazine, a Torah magazine, to which many Orthodox rabbis contribute.
Yes.
Well, you must know them.
Yeah, well, first of all, the conservative movement in Israel has moved far to the right of the conservative movement in America. Far to the right. Even the reform movement in Israel is to the right of many conservative rabbis in America. I tell you, there was a story of a young man who came into my shul in Baltimore, and he was new to the shul. So I went over and introduced myself to him, and he became a friend of mine and what we call a ben bayis. You know what a ben bayis means? Mm-hmm. Every Shabbos he came to my house and ate the Shabbos meal with my family. He was a young man who originally attended Georgetown University, and he was totally uneducated in Judaism, knew nothing basically. And when he was in his senior year in Georgetown, which is a Jesuit college, he took a course with a certain priest, father, whatever they call him, and the father assigned him to write a paper on his Jewish roots. So he sat down and he wrote a paper on his Jewish roots. Lo and behold, he discovered, he knew nothing about his roots. So when he graduated from Georgetown, he decided to go to the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati and study Judaism. So he goes to the Hebrew Union College. He stays there for a number of years. He gets ordained as a Reform rabbi. He goes out into the world and takes a position in a small little Reform congregation. And lo and behold, after 2 or 3 years, he discovers there's no such thing as Reform lay people. It's a social club. They have no ideology. They don't sit there and decide which mitzvahs are going to keep, which ones are not, and this and that. They just reject everything. They get together and they sing hymns, and they have an Israeli flag in their synagogue, and that's the end of it. There's no ideology of the lay people. So he decides he needs to become a conservative rabbi. So he goes to the Jewish Theological Seminary, and he studies there for a number of years, including a year in Israel. This man is very smart. He learns Hebrew, he learns Gemara, he learns everything, and he becomes a conservative rabbi. He goes off to a conservative temple, becomes the rabbi in York, Pennsylvania, which is about 45 minutes away from Baltimore. Lo and behold, he discovers there's no such thing as lay leadership. There's no lay ideological members of the conservative show. It's a social thing, and they don't have any basic idea of what they're doing, what they accept, what they reject. Therefore, he says, I cannot be a conservative rabbi. So he comes to Baltimore, and he finds a position in Baltimore, and he chances into the same shul that I daven in. And he introduces himself to me, and we become friends, and he stays with me. And he says to me, Avrum, I am halachically Jewish in practice. I keep Shabbos, I eat kosher, I don't drive to shul on Shabbos, I do all of the things. Ritually, I am Orthodox. Ideologically, I am conservative. I believe in egalitarian services, I believe in egalitarian practices, whatever it is. I'm ideologically conservative, I'm a practicing Jew. So again, he was a kind of a person who went out and saw there's no such thing as a conservative lay body. There's no such thing as a Reform lay body. There are rabbis conservative, there are rabbis Reform, but the lay people, they have no ideological underpinnings.
Rabbi Kushner?
Rabbi Kushner was a conservative who had strong underpinnings. Rabbi Kushner but he wrote that book that really is troublesome. Why bad things happen to good people, when he lost his son. Mm-hmm. And he couldn't come to grips with God taking away his son. Therefore, he believed, he created some theory of hands-off. God takes a hands-off position to what happens in this world. In many cases, he wasn't able to define when he didn't, when he did, but basically in terms of his own personal tragedy, he believed God had a hands-off position, because he could not believe that a compassionate, loving God would have taken his son. And that's why he wrote that book. It became a bestseller, that book. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. I don't judge people like that, because their pain is so deep. Okay, my friends, have a great week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.